Hello everyone, thank you for being with us today in this new edition of Signals Understanding the Coronavirus Crisis. As a quick reminder, your microphones have been muted by default. Please, if you have any question, feel free to type them in the question dialog box. Jennifer, it's all yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon or good morning to all of you. Thank you for being with us for this last Signals webinar before summer break. So over the next 45 minutes, we'll share with you our latest updates. We'll talk about what we're learning, about the context, people, and of course implications for brands as this crisis unfolds and goes through different phases all around the world. Today, Simon will first remind us about the latest Ipsos resources to better understand what's going on and the different aspects of this crisis and the implications it has. Then Simon will talk with April, who is joining us from New York, who will talk about ethnography and how we have been using this to better understand people's personal journeys across the pandemic. Then Chris will be with us again to update us with 5 new things that we've learned about how consumers are changing their behaviors and what this means for brands. Jean-François will then share our new analysis that is very useful to help companies and organizations think of building stronger relationships with consumers, very important in these times where people are emotionally shaken. And at last, Sean will also be back to tell us about creativity and how advertisers have been evolving in the past few weeks. And now to you, Simon.
Thank you, Jennifer, and hello everybody. Thank you for being with us today. I think one of the big themes of recent weeks and months has been the growth of information about the crisis. And I think our big challenge now is how can we make sense of it all? What we've been trying to do is to bring together some of the latest research we've been doing around the world in a digestible format, and our latest edition is out later today. We've also been asking our experts to come up with some perspectives and points of view. We're going to be hearing from some of them later, but we've also published in the couple of weeks since the last webinar 2 new research practitioner pieces, one around product testing research and one around mixed mode research to help us better adapt our techniques, if you like, as we meet the needs of consumers and work well with them in getting the information we need. And talking of the information we need, I think one of the big critical things we're finding as those weeks have become months is the need to stay really close to those emerging consumer attitudes and behaviours. Even a quick look over the last few days shows us that this is not a linear process and we have to be really in touch with the latest findings. Chris is going to share the latest instalment from the Essentials survey in a moment. But those of you who were with us at the last couple of webinars will remember that he's underlined the importance of getting close, if you like, to those real lived experiences on the ground. And so we wanted to start the session today by looking at the work we've been doing in terms of ethnography and in terms of trying to understand people's own journeys going through the crisis. So we're going to share a video with you in a moment. We're going to just load it up now, so there might be a couple of seconds before it comes on, and then we're going to pick up with April and discuss what we've been learning along the way.
I don't want to say desolate, but there's no one here. So there's not really much of a neighborhood feel. One of the great things about being in New York is that I do have this very immediate community that's around me all the time. Up here, I don't. This is my roommate's house. We are currently upstate, about 2 hours outside of New York City. We left for the pandemic. It's made me realize that this country is long overdue for a very big change in the way we view and treat the poor. Working class people, immigrants. What we're seeing right now in the response, the health response to this pandemic, we're seeing it decimate Black and brown communities, poorer communities, and that's because healthcare has a hierarchy in this country. If you're poor, you're expected to go to work, potentially die. If you're rich, you have the luxury of being able to work from home. Yeah, my biggest fear is the health and safety of my parents. I am deathly afraid that something is going to happen to them. They are in their 70s. They are working right now. They're in childcare, so they are deemed essential workers. And my parents are not in the greatest financial situation. They have to keep working. And, you know, the double-edged sword for them is that staying open means that they will be able to afford staying alive. But staying open also puts them highly at risk for contracting the virus, you know, pretty up there in age. So they're kind of the target demographic for the people that are dying. And it's scary. It's something I wrestle with and think about all the time. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah, it's just, it's scary.
And if I can invite the rest of the presenters on the webinar to join us on stage, welcome to you all, and big welcome to April. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about that research that you and the team have been doing. Jordan was one of 30 people I think we've been following in the last 3 months. Can you tell us a bit more about the approach that we've adopted and what we've been seeing along the way?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that's good, thanks.
So actually it's more than 30 people, Simon, because we extended that to, it started as a global study and we extended it to do within the U.S. in particular. So we've got some more families covering different segments of the U.S. Because our cultures here have responded very differently as well. So what we wanted to do was starting out was to really try to capture the journey of people on a day-to-day basis. Normally, you know, I run our ethnography and immersion practice. Normally we'd be with people right in their homes and in their environments, seeing the things that are influencing them, you know, beyond what they might tell you. But because of the pandemic, we had to scale that back a little bit and make it more about people sending us videos as to what it is they think. I will say that we learned some very new things, you know, to have anthropologists and ethnographers looking at the videos and examining the footage as data really does give you a whole different perspective, I think, on the stories that people choose to tell you, right, and choose to send you in the midst of this, and how they answer our questions and tasks that we've given them to do longitudinally over a given period of time.
So okay, so because they've been doing their own videos, you've almost seen it through an additionally different lens.
Correct.
What have been perhaps the standout perhaps observations or surprises in following people through these journeys?
Yeah, so, you know, normally the surprises would be, you know, the things that people say versus what they actually do, you know, kind of catching them in their little white lies that they do. This thing has just been, you know, the whole thing has been a complete surprise, right? That video of Jordan was taken early on. If you remember, it said in May that was taken. That was before the protests had happened. But if you hear what he said, it was almost prophetic, right? He talked about time for change. You can start to, certain things are starting to be exposed around how we treat people and how people have been affected by this disease and this virus. So I think that the big surprise for me is as the whole thing just unfolded, it was just sort of seeing the hints that you could have picked up on early on, that now you just see it coming and happening just so much faster and in such bigger ways than you would have ever imagined.
Yeah, I mean, and to pick up on Jordan's story, I mean, he then went back to the city and found himself involved in the protests as they unfolded, didn't he?
Yeah, so he actually was very, very active in the protests. I mean, we have footage later on where he's marching in the streets and there's tear gas and he's one of the callers, you know, the chants that happen in protests. He's one of the people leading that and doing the calling. So he really felt, you know, and you saw this need for him to do that build up from the point where, you know, first it was just this, I'm worried about my parents, to this has got to change. There's something very wrong with what we've now seen. So that was just, it was just an incredible experience, quite frankly, to just even watch his evolution over time.
Through this whole kind of set of experiences with the different people we've been following, we've got examples like that, and we've also got those rich, kind of almost like one-to-one or one-to-two or one-to-three perspectives from some of the individual families we've been following. I think that's been certainly something which has really, I think, illustrated some of the uncertainty and even at times I think some of the positive sides of people having been in confinement, and that's a learning that we've taken with us, isn't it?
Well, that and all sides of it, right? I mean, there's power in one story for sure, but there's also limits to one story. So I think the way we've A, recruited people, and B, sort of just looked at, you know, the things we've asked them to do and share, now you have several stories that really start to tell, you know, a nice mosaic of the things that are happening, the way people are feeling, and the different things that they're doing in response to, you know, this new way of living that we've all had to deal with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I know that we're going to be seeing a little bit more from some of the different people who've been participating in the research around the world in the presentation from Chris. So, I mean, for the moment, thank you so much for sharing those perspectives with us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
No, thank you. And I'm going to hand back to Jennifer in our studio in Milan.
Yes, thanks so much. And from Milan, I still have another little question for New York, April, if you don't mind. So it was really great to see how we can, you know, discover so much about people and understand so much, especially in these very sort of troubled times. It's so important. And I was wondering what your one learning would be for the people on this call in terms of making informed decisions about their brand in this sort of, you know, so particular and strange context.
Yeah, so you know, we've all seen that businesses and brands play a very important role in all of this, right? I think, you know, government role has shifted, different things have shifted that we used to count on. So now brands and businesses really are a part of how people feel and the things that they learn and what they know. I think that in understanding your brand and the role that it plays, it is really important to be there in the moment as some of these decisions are being made. How do you influence behaviors as they're changing and evolving, and, you know, different things are being considered? If you're there as that's happening, you can really start to influence that. So that's the first piece. The other piece is now, you know, if you've missed that, and we're kind of at another point, is looking back at what's happened through this period of time and see if you could start to project what's going to happen as this continues to play out, because it's going to be a while. I think we all have come to that realization that it's not going away tomorrow.
Definitely. Great. Thanks so much. So really important to have our hands on the pulse of people. And Chris is going to take us into a little journey exactly about that.
Very good.
Chris?
Yes, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, April. Yes, want to segue into this week's edition of 5 Things to Know, coming from our Essentials study and from the ethnography that April has been describing. Just very quickly, for those of you who aren't aware, each week we do connect with 1,000 consumers per country in 16 major markets around the world. And as you've seen, we also do this longitudinal ethnography, and we'll be drawing from both of those sources as we talk about this week's 5 things that we've learned. Item number 1, I think it is safe to say we are in the midst of a crisis that can now be described as multidimensional. It is medical, it is financial, political, social, and environmental. We are dealing with quite a lot at once. And at this point, if you focus your attention on the left-hand side of the screen, only 1 in 3 people globally have not been impacted or threatened medically or financially. And if you take your eyes to the right side, you can see in the graphic here, both medical and financial setbacks carry quite an emotional toll. And taken in tandem, for those 28% of households who have endured both, you can see that the emotional impact is quite acute. So, you know, Jennifer's opening line about people being emotionally shaken is quite accurate and well taken. Second thing to know I think it is also fair to say we are right now a world on pause. I have shown you this chart in the last several sessions where we ask people to classify themselves into one of these 8 groupings to best describe where they stand in their COVID journey. Now, for the first time in 8 weeks, our steady international advance towards reentry has now stalled. And you'll see the note there to the right, the previously surging sentiment to restart the economy has also flattened just in this last week. And I think it's fair to say that we are conflicted about the degree to which we should re-engage, particularly when it comes to spending and investment. So we've quoted a number of our panelists in the ethnography here. One of the quotes from China on the far left is saying, right now we prefer conservative investments and capital preservation. You hear from France on the right side of the screen where one of our panelists is saying, yes, I've saved some money, it's there to be spent. But on the other side, I am afraid of going broke, so I'm just stuck in the middle. A similar sentiment is captured in the quote at the bottom of the page. Should I be living my life to the fullest? Should I be spending the money I have? I really don't know. And then in the center of the screen is a quote from the United States where this fellow is saying, look, everything's on hold. I'm not going to put my money into the market where I can't get to it because there might be another spike in the fall. So indeed, I think we are looking at a world on pause. And you're starting to see evidence that there are real fears, real concerns about a second wave of infections. Building on that point, that is actually our third thing to know, is that there are emerging second wave worries. They have a little bit different nature than the first wave. What we see in the graphic here is that the majority of folks internationally are anxious about resuming normal activities. And that anxiety trend is pointed upward in most countries. We also have to wonder, with Melbourne back in lockdown just recently and various U.S. states reassessing their reentry strategies, it does seem as if those numbers are going to be poised for continued escalation. If we turn our attention to the qualitative side of the ledger and look at some of the quotes around the second wave, what we see is that the worries about a second wave of infection are now accompanied by the threat of an elongated financial crisis and an elongated social crisis. If you look at some of these quotes from Muriel in France, she says, the second wave worries me. There are already people struggling a lot. They won't be able to financially deal with another lockdown. And then the point in blue there, when we see the rage that's growing at the moment, I really don't see a second lockdown happening calmly. So there is this growing anxiety that A, there will be a second wave, and B, that it might not be quite so peaceful as the first. The fourth thing to know, and we're calling this one you first, and I'll explain that in a second. There is a tension between our desire to re-engage and some unpleasant reminders that some of our previous routines now come with a stifling rule book. If you look at the quote there from the woman in the United States, I think this really brings that to light vividly. And this is kind of playing out in unprecedented ways where we say seemingly contradictory things like this about what we want versus what we're willing to do. And remember that video that we shared with you of Jordan talking earlier when he was describing his parents' dilemma. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. He said, basically they need to work to live, but re-engagement puts their lives at risk. So it's an incredibly perplexing dilemma, that many people are facing right now. And this all kind of leads to the thinking that's being expressed on the lower half of the page, where the quote here is saying from the UK, we can't just remain locked down indefinitely. Slow progression's good, and I feel happy about that. But then she turns in the next breath and says, look, if there's something I don't feel comfortable with, I'm not going to go. Like I won't go to a pub just yet, but I will let others go. And that's where we kind of get this you first headline, right? There is kind of an after you, my friend mentality here. Okay, last. I have said 4 very gloomy things to you. So to lighten this up a little bit, the fifth thing to know has a much brighter message. In recessionary times, we do seek to cut our overall spend, but consumers will still seek affordable indulgences. And when we compare some of our usage data to that we witnessed in May, we do see increases in penetration of indulgent but inexpensive categories. And when we look at people who now report paying more for things like makeup and beer, they are more likely to classify those items as treats. So when we look at some of the quotes here to the right side of the page from the ethnography, you see some of our participants are kind of bringing this concept to life. And that last quote captures that, I think, quite nicely, where the person says, look, I'm trying to save money, but I do allow myself some treats, things that are for me, really. So if I recap this, our 5 things to know. Thing number 1, yes, we are in a multidimensional crisis. It has led to emotional destabilization for many. It has also led to a world on pause, where many people are playing things quite conservatively. There is also a growing fear of a second wave, and an accompanying fear that the second wave might be a bit more combustible and less quiet than the first. The 4th thing, this after you, friend, point, there are some contradictions between what we say we want and versus what we're actually willing to do right now. And then lastly, we do find modest joys, simple pleasures, and affordable indulgences. So if you're a brand leader, if you're an insights leader right now, there is a need to discern between stated desires and what people are actually willing to do. And we've got to adjust to their emotional state and to their financial capacity. And then last, I think in times like these, it is good to remind ourselves to kind of a ray of hope for brands, a ray of hope for consumers. A little bit of happiness does indeed go a long way. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Always an honor to present these things. And back to you, Jen.
Thank you, Chris. It was really good to listen to this and to hear about how people are adapting and coping. And I think you've set the scene very, very nicely for our colleague Jean-François, who is going to now take us through his story of the forces behind building strong relationships with customers who are also the people that, Chris, you have just talked about. So, Jean-François, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Chris. So yes, I will walk you through our framework, the forces of customer experience and how it can be used. But before I do so, I think it's important to put things into context. Right now, health and safety is clearly a big priority for businesses. Organizations are investing heavily to deliver experiences to customers that are in line with health and safety guidelines. And our data also shows that health and safety is very important for customers. I could show you some hard numbers, but I think the quote that Chris showed from that lady in the US that says that she doesn't really want to go back to the restaurant because she was uneasy with the appearance of the gloves, I think sums it all up. Health and safety is hugely important. It's almost a hygiene factor. But at the same time, as we start thinking about building a new customer experience vision, creating the experience of the future, we really need to have a broader understanding of customers' functional but also relational needs in order to drive these strong relationships. And actually staying close to customers and truly addressing their needs in these challenging times is really expected to drive a certain amount of goodwill amongst customers and some form of emotional attachment. So our data shows that emotional attachment is really key to drive stronger relationships and higher customer lifetime values. On the left-hand side here, you can see a simple way to segment customers according to their level of relationship strengths with organizations. We have 3 groups. Customers that are unfulfilled, they are fundamentally dissatisfied with an organization offering. We then have customers that are functionally satisfied. They feel the organization is delivering well on the basics, but they have not really formed any sort of special bond with that organization. And finally, towards the higher end of relationship strengths, we have customers that are emotionally attached. They are not only functionally satisfied, but they've also created and formed a special affinity or bond with the organization. And on the right-hand side, we are showing traditional customer experience KPIs, such as preference, NPS, which stands for Net Promoter Score, which is a proxy for advocacy, and likelihood to continue, which is a proxy for retention. And you can see, if you compare the scores for the three groups, that there are some benefits associated to recreating that functional satisfaction, to moving people from being unfulfilled to functionally satisfied. But there are huge gains to be had by driving customers toward that higher level of relationship strength, towards that sort of emotional attachment state. So when customers are emotionally attached, they're far more likely to prefer the brand, they're far more likely to become advocates, and far more likely to continue with the brand. And these sort of behaviors have got a direct impact on revenue. So emotional attachment is a worthy goal, but what we really wanted to find out was whether we could provide some guidance to organizations in terms of understanding how to optimize the experiences that they deliver to drive these strong relationships. So we carried out some R&D across several regions, and in collaboration with our global behavioral science team, we created a framework for customer experience, which is called the Forces of CX, which is designed to provide that guidance to drive stronger relationships. And these dimensions that you can see here have been validated to be strong predictors of relationship strengths. So these dimensions are fair treatment, certainty, control, status, belonging, and enjoyment. So I won't go through all of them, but I want to just mention a few of them, and also they're relevant to the current situation. So fair treatment. All the research that we've done in the past shows that fair treatment is hugely important when it comes to building strong relationships. Fundamentally, if an organization's value proposition or service handling is unfair, customers simply won't engage further. It's of course very important for organizations right now not to be seen to be profiting unfairly from the situation. So we've seen some great initiatives. So for example, some car insurance providers have given a rebate to customers as they can't drive currently as often as they could before, and that's a way to drive that sort of perception of fair treatment. The second one that I want to mention is certainty. Customer choice at all times involves some degree of uncertainty, but that's particularly true in challenging times. So here the challenge for brands is to provide that reassurance, to provide very sort of clear communications around how the service will be delivered, to try and mitigate some of these feelings of uncertainty. Belonging, I want to mention as well, because I think it's fascinating. We found in our research that when customers feel that they share the same values as the organization they deal with, and when the values are really delivered on the ground through the customer experience, they are far more likely to engage in truly meaningful and long-lasting relationships. And the last one I want to mention is enjoyment. Chris also mentioned indulgence, and we think it's important even in challenging times. And enjoyment is interesting because it can take different shapes depending on the sector. Sometimes it's about the pleasure of the experience itself. So if we think about restaurants or possibly hotels, but in quite a lot of other cases in sectors such as insurance or banking, it's really about providing products or services that make customers' life easier, that removes the hassle so they can feel a sense of freedom. So these are the dimensions that we are that predict, if you want, the strengths of relationships. But as part of our R&D, we also wanted to make the model very actionable. So we were able to identify some questions or statements that we can include in surveys so that organizations can measure how they perform against the competition and create action plans accordingly. So I want to finish by showing you some actual data from the R&D we collected in UK, but also in Latin America. And one thing I get asked very often is whether the forces of customer experience are relevant to different geographies and different cultures. And the answer is yes. They are relevant, and they apply because they are fundamentally based on human needs and motivations. But whilst they apply, the interesting part is that it's the hierarchy of importance that can vary significantly depending on cultures and regions. On the left, whilst you can see that for the UK, fair treatment and status come up as most important, for Brazil, belonging really stands out. So of course we talked to our Latin American colleagues, and to get some interpretation. And of course, Brazil is a country where there are significant socio-economic differences and still a huge proportion of customers who do not really have access to services. And that means that the role that brands can play in working for the greater good is crucial, and that can explain why belonging is standing out for Brazil. But if you look at Chile, that's quite interesting because it shows that not all Latin American countries are the same. They don't behave in the same way. Chile is a different country in the sense that norms and structures are very well established, and being serious and trustworthy are important personal characteristics, and as a result we see certainty coming out more strongly. So beyond cultural differences, of course we also see that the relative importance of the forces can vary significantly depending on the sector, and even for different brands within a given sector. So it's important for companies and brands to work out which forces are most important for their customers, and to try and create action plans accordingly. So to wrap up, I would say that the forces of CX is a framework that's grounded in behavioral science that helps organizations optimize their customer journeys so that they drive the right response, the right impact on these important forces, which in turn can drive stronger relationship strengths, which lead to increased customer outcomes such as retention, advocacy, share of spend, or operational efficiencies. These are the customer outcomes that all businesses try to drive. And in turn, these increased outcomes lead to what we call a better ROCE, a better return on customer experience investment. So that was a quick tour of our model. Thank you very much.
That was great, Jean-François. Thanks a lot. And I guess I found it very interesting to see those differences across the different markets that you were showing there. And so it's clear that there are differences, but you were also pointing out the fact that some of these forces seem to be particularly relevant in these times. So could you tell us a little bit more about that? And is there one in particular that we should be mindful of?
Yeah, I would say that certainty relates to security. So as we said, from the beginning of the webinar, it is becoming more important and really has more sort of weight now. The only one, if I may, Jennifer, that I would like to mention is belonging. I think there is no, at this time, it's very important for brands to try and really express and deliver on their promises and their purpose. So I think that's also one that I would like to mention.
Great, thanks. Thanks a lot for that additional perspective. And now I'm going to hand over to Sean, asking him one question. Sean, is creativity back?
That's a good question. Thank you, Jennifer. Well, you mentioned right at the beginning, I was lucky enough to present in the second edition of the Signals webinar on the creative fight back. But as you said, the million-dollar question today is creativity back. And well, we'll answer that in a few slides. But last month we even saw the Cannes Festival of Creativity take place. Not the same. There was no French sunshine and rosé, but perhaps a bit of inspiration to indeed help bring creativity back. And of course, we all know what a brand is. It exists in our minds. It's a network of memory associations and experiences, thoughts, feelings, images, and sounds that we easily encode and retrieve. But where does creative come in? Often so many choices and ambivalence to many brands, creative remains one of the last unfair advantages to strengthen and refresh those networks of memories. So while marketers have been planning, regardless of their messaging they've been building, whether it's COVID specific or messaging to the new mindset of today's consumer, creativity definitely still matters and is definitely king. And what creative does here is it needs to capture obviously attention and encode those memories that can later influence brand choice. Now, as I said, 2 months ago, just early on in April, I mentioned going dark is not the answer, and I referenced two particular gentlemen, one being Mark Ritson and the other being the chief executive of General Mills. Well, since then, some brands have come out and spoken about their decisions in this period in the crisis. And you can see the quote from Coca-Cola saying, the decision to be dark is not sustainable in the longer term, especially now that customers are becoming more active. Or P&G's CFO saying, P&G, and that was earlier in the middle of April, saying that they're doubling down, and it's no wonder that P&G was just nominated a few weeks ago as the Lions brand marketer of the decade. But of course, they've made these statements because they're backed, obviously they've looked at the data and learned a lot from previous recessions. Because if we take it one step further and you ask, what should advertising be doing to capture the right motivation at this point in time, which is of course a good question. And of course, as we've seen from many of the presentations, we've moved out of this phase of disbelief and preparation and more into a phase of acclimatization and relief, and even post-COVID. So other elements become more important, such as enjoyment, positivity. And I'll just reflect on first a bit of data that we presented a while back on the US at the end of March, where we asked people what do they expect from advertising, and we saw there that a lot of the responses came back in line with what I just said, providing security for us or some sense of positivity, and a very small piece of people saying advertising should stop. A few weeks later in Italy, we did the same exercise. Granted that the crisis was a lot further in Italy, we could see that positivity and enjoyment became even more important for the Italians. And a few weeks later, the same exercise in France, and we could see their enjoyment at the height of the crisis, or as the crisis was getting at its peak phase, enjoyment became even important. Of course, as Jean-Francois said, culture is important, but why am I telling you this? Because marketers and advertisers can use this information to know what's important when they produce their advertising to be put on TV or in platforms. Unfortunately, people have reacted to the advertising that have taken place in the midst of the crisis, and we've labeled it as an overdose of COVID communication. So what we've seen is that a lot of the advertising during this period has actually been suffering from what we call a sea of sameness, so getting caught up in the same kinds of messaging, and brands really suffering from a lack of brand linkage and an ability to encode those memories I spoke about a little bit earlier. So we've seen really brands struggling, and a mixed bag of results during this period, as you can see from some of the quotes in the slide here from some of the respondents. But there is hope, and one example I'd like to talk about is one from Budweiser. We'll show the ad at the end of the webinar, so you can see it. But I've labeled it as a refreshingly good example, and anyone who was around in 1999 will remember this ad from the US. It was aired in 1999 and was kind of a cult ad that people remember, the WhatsApp ad from Budweiser. So Budweiser had, well, ABI InBev had the question as to, is this really appropriate to air during COVID, during the crisis, and can we edit it in a way that it depicts the quarantine situation? That was their key creative challenge, of course, some other things, and they did a really, really good job. In fact, if we compare the results of the Budweiser ad here, which you can see circled in red on this chart on the 2x2 scatter plot, you can see they did really much better than any of the other ads from the other categories that we did research in here on, so telecommunications, etc. And the reason for that is that Budweiser really delivered a clear message of what the brand stood for, but also the message was clearly delivered by saying that Budweiser helps connect friends, and it was a good message where the brand was not forgotten. So building on what April said earlier, had a role to play in this crisis in a very relatable way and empathetic way, and we could see also the PR that the brand got. You can see the quote from Ad Age here was really, really positive. The last thing I'd like to say before I get to wrap up is that I think Budweiser were very clear in using this distinct assets that they have, and that's an important thing not to forget. And we saw in the COVID overdose of COVID communication that I spoke about, that maybe that had been lost in a lot of the sea of sameness, but many brands have assets that they can use, and we've written a paper on that called The Power of You that talks about these different assets, whether they're colors, creative style, sound, pack, etc. And so that's definitely an advantage that a brand can use. So there are 3 lessons I'll leave you with. The one that we heard is don't get caught in the sea of sameness or rush to produce creative that is not connected to or impactful for your brand. Number 2, the presence of brand assets are very, very important because they're strong and highly correlate to branded memorability or attention, which we know is important as attention is table stakes today in the advertising world. And last but not least, creative quality still matters, and Jennifer is definitely back. And so I'll leave you with that message.
Great. Thank you so much, Sean. And we are going to watch the ads together. But before that, thank you for confirming that creativity is back. But I'm thinking that it's more than just creativity. It seems that stories are back, right?
Yes, absolutely. And there are 2 stories. So I have 2 now this afternoon that I'd like to talk about. So the one I just saw breaking on the 1st of July in the femcare category for a brand called Bodyform, and they created this long-form story called For Womb Stories. If you haven't seen it, I'd recommend you look at that. It's perfect because it is a longer form story, just brilliantly done, but also leveraging assets as well. The other one that I saw again from ABI just a moment ago on campaign creativity was for Stella Artois. Again, a beautiful story, but also including those brand assets in it that people will recognize. So yes, absolutely, storytelling is back.
Great, very, very good. So we're going to share the Bud story. And before that, I just want to say thank you very much to all the speakers. Thank you very much to all of you who have been with us. And we want to see you again on September the 10th for our reopening of our webinar series.